Gildan Media, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Writing Revolution, a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades, by Judith C. Hochman and Natalie Wexler. Forward by Doug Lemov. Narrated by Margaret Strom. Forward. A few years ago, our family spent a couple of months in London. My kids were 13, 11, and 6 at the time, and I had work there, so we decided to take the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to live in one of the world's great capitals. We paid regular visits to the British Museum, combed through the food stalls at Borough Market, and traced on foot the remains of the city's medieval wall. There were day trips to Bath and Cambridge. We even had a local pub, that is, which really should go without saying. It was an incredible experience, thanks in no small part to what I learned at a lunch I had with one of the authors of this book before we left. I'd read an article about Judith Hochman's work at New Dorp High School in the Atlantic a year or two before, and it had stayed with me. Hochman espoused embedding writing instruction in content. She thought sentences were overlooked and rarely taught. She thought syntax, syntactic control, was the link to unlock the connection between better writing and better reading. She believed in the power of deliberate practice to build reading skills. Her work was technical and granular, and the results were hard to ignore. It was the kind of thing I was drawn to. A friend had connected us, and I drove down to meet her. With what soon revealed itself as typical graciousness, she had invited me to her home near New York City, and the result was one of the most memorable days of my working life. I remember scratching notes furiously on page after page of my notebook, trying to capture everything she observed about writing, its connection to reading and thinking, and about why so many kids struggled to learn it. Over and over, Hochman would hit on an idea that had been swirling in my head in inchoate wisps and put it into a clear, logical formulation of practice. Here was the idea you were fumbling with, described perfectly. Here was how you'd make it work. I couldn't write fast enough, but I remember thinking that when I got home, I would read everything she'd written. This, however, turned out to be the only disappointment. There wasn't, until now, any place where the ideas Hochman had talked about were written down in one cohesive place for a reader like me. I was left with the observations in my notebook, the hope that Hochman would someday write the book you are now holding, and her sentence expansion activities. It was these activities that were the gift that transformed our trip to London. Hochman had spent about 20 minutes riffing on the idea the day we met. The sentence was the building block of writing and thinking. The complete thought, we agreed. But if you looked at the complete thoughts students produced in their writing, they were too often wooden, repetitive, inflexible. If the task of wrestling ideas into written words was to memorialize thinking, students, at least most of them, did not often have control of a sufficient number of syntactic forms and tools to capture and express complex thoughts. They could not express two ideas happening at once, with one predominating over the other. They could not express a thought interrupted by a sudden alternative thesis. Their ideas were poor on paper because their sentences could not capture, connect, and ultimately develop them. That last part was the most damning of all. One way to generate complex ideas is to write them into being, often slowly adding and reworking and refining, as I find myself doing now as I draft and revise this forward for the 10th or 20th or 100th time. Because students could not say what they meant, and because, as a result, they did not practice capturing and connecting complex ideas with precision in writing, they had fewer complex ideas. Or they had ideas like the sentences they wrote, predictable, neither compound nor complex. What might have been a skein of thought was instead a litter of short, broken threads, each with a subject-verb-object construction. Hochman's solution was regular intentional exercises to expand students' syntactic range. You could ask them to practice expanding their sentences in specific and methodical ways, and they'd get better at it. Crucially, she pointed out, this must be done in a content-rich environment because the content drives the rigor. Sentences needed ideas pressing outward from inside them to stretch and expand their limits. Only rich content gave them a reason to seek and achieve nuance. One example of a Hochman sentence expansion exercise was called Because, But, So. The idea was deceptively simple. You gave students a sentence stem and then asked them to expand it 3 different ways, with the common conjunctions because, but, and so. This would help them to see each sentence as constantly expandable, and it would, as Hochman writes in this book, prod them to think critically and deeply about the content they were studying, far more so than if you simply ask them to write a sentence in answer to an open-ended question. It would build their ability to conjoin ideas with fluidity. It would help them to understand, through constant theme and variation, the broader concepts of subordination and coordination. I want to pause here to digress on the seemingly underwhelming concepts of coordination and subordination. I will ask you to stifle your yawn as I acknowledge that they are easy to dismiss. Ancient, faintly risible, uttered once long ago by acolytes of sentence diagramming in the era of chalk dust. They smack of grammar for grammar's sake, and almost nobody cares about that. Teachers instead seek mostly to simply make sure the sentences work and dispense with the parsing of parts. It is so much simpler to tell kids to go with sounds right, an idea that inherently discriminates against those for whom the sounds of language are not happily ingrained by luck or privilege, or to make the odd episodic correction and not worry about the principle at work. But coordination and subordination are, in fact, deeply powerful principles worth mastering. They describe the ways that ideas are connected, the nuances that yoke disparate thoughts together. It is the connections as much as the ideas that make meaning. To master conjunctions is to be able to express that 2 ideas are connected, but that one is more important than the other, that one is dependent on the other, that one is contingent on the other, that the 2 ideas exist in contrast or conflict. Mastering that skill is immensely important, not just to writing, but to reading. Students who struggle with complex text can usually understand the words and clauses of a sentence. It is the piecing together of the interrelationships among them that most often poses the problem. They understand the first half of the sentence, but miss the cue that questions its veracity in the second half. And so without mastery of the syntax of relationships, which is what coordination and subordination are, the sentence devolves, for weak readers, into meaninglessness. For weeks, I reflected on the power of these simple activities for teachers and students, but my reflections were not limited to my role as an educator. As a father, I was intrigued as well, and I suppose this is the truest test of an educational idea. Fast forward to London some months later, where I found myself for 3 months essentially homeschooling the Lemov children. those regular and long-suffering subjects of 1,000 of their father's teaching ideas. To keep them writing and thinking, I had them keep journals, and in those journals, I found myself using and adapting Hochman's exercises. They were the perfect tidy-wrap summation to a long day out exploring. Here are some early because, but, so exercises I rediscovered a few weeks ago in my then 11-year-old daughter's journal. I gave her the sentence stem, "The Great Fire of London burned 4/5 of the city." She wrote, "The Great Fire of London burned 4/5 of the city because, at the time, citizens didn't have the knowledge or equipment to stop the fire before it spread." The Great Fire of London burned 4/5 of the city, but London survived and thrived. The Great Fire of London burned 4/5 of the city, so many people had to live in temporary homes until the city was rebuilt. After a visit to the Museum of Natural History, she wrote for the sentence stem, "The length of T-Rex's arms is surprising." The length of T-Rex's arms is surprising, but this may have been a mid-evolutionary stage, and had they lived for another 1,000,000 years, their arms might have disappeared altogether. A few weeks later, I gave her this sentence stem. "Farley Hungerford Castle is now in ruins." She wrote, "Farley Hungerford Castle is now in ruins because of weathering and age." Farley Hungerford Castle is now in ruins, but it is arguably even more interesting now, while in ruins, than ever before. Farley Hungerford Castle is now in ruins, so you are able to use some imagination when envisioning the castle at its peak. We made these exercises a part of our daily lives, and as we did so, their confidence and the range of syntactical forms my kids used in expanding their sentences grew, as did the ideas they developed and encoded in memory. Another sentence expansion activity Hochman proposed to me in her living room, and describes at long last in this outstanding book, is deliberate practice using appositives, brief, sometimes parenthetical phrases that, like the phrase you are reading, rename or elaborate on a noun in a sentence, and which can be surprisingly complex. Mastering this idea enables students to expand ideas within a sentence, adding detail, specificity, or nuance in a manner that subordinates the additional information to the overall idea of the sentence. With appositives mastered, students can link more things into the dance of interrelationships within a sentence, reducing the redundancy and disconnectedness of multiple repetitive sentences. And the Lemov kids reflected on their travels through the music of appositives as well. After a visit to Cambridge and its historic university, I asked them to use Hochman's appositive exercise with the sentence, "In Cambridge, the backs are in fact the fronts." You may not understand that sentence at all. It refers to the fact that when you punt down the River Cam, you face what are called the backs of the historic colleges. But this name is ironic because the buildings were mostly built to be seen from the riversides, the backs. My daughter's sentence expansion captures this with a smooth elegance that supersedes the laborious description you just read. She wrote, "In Cambridge, a small town with a world-renowned university, the backs, the sides of the colleges that face away from the street and therefore onto the river, are in fact the elaborate entrances, the fronts." I put the appositives she added in italics. Note here A few things that are interesting about this sentence from a teaching and learning perspective. 1. It includes 3 different appositives, which my daughter used to expand her description of Cambridge, turning it from a sentence whose meaning was locked in code, what the backs and fronts meant is very specific to Cambridge, and unlocked it for readers less familiar with the subject. This form of explication is common to papers written in academic discourse and is a key academic skill. But even so, the 3 appositives are surprisingly complex. 2. The second appositive, which explains what the phrase "the backs" means, is in fact a compound appositive. First, she includes the idea that the backs are the sides of Cambridge's colleges that face away from the street. The phrase stands up as an appositive by itself, but then she adds, via subordination, a second appositive, explaining that the backs are also the sides of the buildings that face the river. Necessity is the mother of invention. In her effort to explain what she knows and enrich the sentence sufficiently, she's expanded her range, experimenting with a doubly complex form of appositive. 3. The third example is even more interesting. In it, my daughter has reversed the common order of appositive formation. Usually, the noun in a sentence is followed by an appositive phrase that expands upon it. But here, she has instead put the appositive in front of the noun. The sides of the colleges that face away from the street and therefore onto the river are, in fact, the elaborate entrances, the fronts. She has flipped the form and is again experimenting with her growing proficiency. No grammar lesson in the world could socialize her to understand and apply compound appositives and inverted appositives. But there she was, within just a few weeks, crafting carefully wrought sentences. As our time in London went on, I began experimenting with new sentence expansion activities, and they became a bit of an adventure for my kids. Could they express an idea that mattered and also meet the challenges of construction I set for them? Could they, after visiting Kew Gardens, write a sentence about medicinal plants, starting with "surprisingly," and another sentence using the word medicinal, and some form of the word extract, i.e., extracting, extraction? Could they write a one-sentence description of the view from Primrose Hill, starting "standing atop," but not using the name Primrose Hill? In this sense, our time in London was an exploration of the power of several themes that you will find constantly referred to in this book. Hochman and Wexler's study of these themes will be immensely useful to you as an educator, I believe. The first theme is the idea that if we want students to be great writers, we have to be willing to sometimes teach writing through intentional exercises. Writing responds to deliberate practice, and this concept is demonstrably different from mere repetition of an activity, which, as Hochman explains, is how many schools attempt to teach writing. Let me restate that in the plainest terms. Merely repeating an activity is insufficient to get you better at it. This is why you are still as poor a driver today as you were when you were 24. You drive to work every morning without intentional focus on a specific aspect of your craft. You don't get feedback. You don't even know what the skills of driving are, really. And so you never get better. You get worse, in fact. Research, particularly that of psychologist Anders Ericsson, tells us that for practice to improve skills, it has to have a specific and focused goal, and must gradually link together a series of smaller goals to created linked skills. It must also be structured in awareness of cognitive load theory. It has to be difficult, to pose a real challenge, but not be so difficult that learners engage in random, non-productive guessing to solve problems, and not so difficult that the brain shuts down. As cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham points out, the brain learns best when it is challenged in a manageable amount. Finally, deliberate practice requires all-in focus, and that is maximized in a short and intense burst. This book's proposal of sequences of adaptable, high-quality exercises that can allow for deliberate practice should be adopted immediately by nearly every school. Second is the idea that writing, thinking, and reading are indelibly linked. They are the three tasks of idea formation, and so there is far-reaching power for all of these domains in focusing on the craft of formation. I write, Joan Didion famously observed, to know what I think. Related, then, is the idea that revision is not especially separable from writing. This much I know as a professional writer. As soon as this sentence emerges on your laptop screen, you are planning its revision. And helping students to master this hidden phase of writing is necessary to ensuring that students develop refined ideas, not just hasty, first blush ones. This book's study of revision's wherefores and whys will be invaluable to schools. Third is the idea that there is a scope and sequence to all this. The numinous task of writing can, in fact, be taught step by step with a bit of intentionality, if you have Hochman's wisdom and knowledge to guide you. Now you don't have to invent it. The tasks and activities are outlined and organized for you here. You can move directly to execution. Fourth is the idea of embedded in content. Writing is a learning activity as much or more than a discrete subject. It operates in synergy with ideas. The need to express them is, after all, the reason for being for what is otherwise an unnatural and artificial activity. This book will help you to make every classroom in your school writing intensive, and therefore learning intensive. If I could wave a magic wand over America's schools and cause one change that would drive the most demonstrable improvement to learning and achievement, I would almost certainly wave that wand and conjure up small bursts of intense, reflective, high-quality writing in every class period or every hour across America's schools. Perhaps last is my own lesson from London. That writing, when taught well, is a joy. You build something real and enduring every time, and this is a source of pleasure, as is the unexpected form it takes. Successful writing gives its practitioner the mystery and satisfaction of constant invention and construction. When you look at the page and wonder, now where did that idea come from? You know you are doing it right. You know your mastery of the craft itself is now guiding you. In that sense, this is a magical book, one that can help you achieve a sea change in the minds of the students in your classrooms. Doug Lemov. Doug Lemov trains educators at Uncommon Schools, the nonprofit school management organization he helped found. He has also authored Teach Like a Champion, now in its 2.0 version, and has co-authored the companion Field Guide, Reading Reconsidered, and Practice Perfect. Throughout the book, we've included student writing samples. Some of these samples are from actual students, under pseudonyms or first names only, and others were created by the Writing Revolution staff members. Some educator and student names have been changed, and in other cases, and where noted, we've used real names with the individual's blessing. Some anecdotes and classroom examples, although based on actual experience, incorporate invented characters and events. Introduction. How to lead a writing revolution in your classroom, and why you need one. When Monica entered high school, her writing skills were minimal. After repeating first grade and getting more than 100 hours of tutoring in elementary school, she'd managed to learn to read well enough to get by, and she was comfortable with math. But writing seemed beyond her reach. During her freshman year at Newdorp, a historically low-performing high school on Staten Island, Monica's history teacher asked her to write an essay on Alexander the Great. "I think Alexander the Great was one of the best military leaders," Monica wrote. Her entire response consisted of 6 simple sentences, one of which didn't make sense. An actual essay, Monica said later, wasn't going to happen. It was like, well, I got a sentence down. What now? Monica's mother, who had spent many frustrating years trying to help her daughter improve her academic performance, was equally skeptical about Monica's ability to write an essay. It just didn't seem like something Monica could ever do. Unfortunately, Monica is far from alone. Across the country, and especially in schools serving students from low-income families and English language learners, thousands of students have similar problems expressing themselves clearly and coherently in writing. On nationwide tests, only about 25% of students are able to score at a proficient level in writing. And yet, expository writing, the kind of writing that explains and informs, is essential for success in school and the workplace. Students who can't write at a competent level struggle in college. With the advent of email and the internet, an increasing number of jobs require solid writing skills. That's true even of many jobs, such as being a paramedic, that people may not think of as involving writing. No matter what path students choose in life, the ability to communicate their thoughts in writing in a way that others can easily understand is crucial. The problem: assigning writing but not teaching it. The problem is not that students like Monica are incapable of learning to write well. Rather, the problem is that American schools haven't been teaching students how to write. Teachers may have assigned writing, but they haven't explicitly taught it in a careful sequence of logical steps beginning at the sentence level. That's not the fault of the teachers. In the vast majority of cases, their training didn't include instruction on how to teach writing. The assumption has been that if students read enough, they'll simply pick up writing skills through a kind of osmosis. But writing is the hardest thing we ask students to do, and the evidence is clear that very few students become good writers on their own. Many students, even at the college level, have difficulty constructing a coherent sentence, let alone a fluid, cohesive essay. If you're listening to this book, chances are that at least some of your students, and perhaps most, fall into that category. To be effective, writing instruction should start in elementary school. But when students do get a chance to write in elementary school, they're often encouraged to write at length too soon, sometimes at a furious pace. They don't learn how to construct interesting and grammatically correct sentences first. And they aren't encouraged to plan or...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?